what I want to know is how many of the islands just immediately set up their own central bank, set up their own currency, or are you still using the dollar very much as a form of exchange too, or and do some of the islands share a currency?
Yes.
How is it working as far as that's concerned?
So upon independence, most of us transitioned to our own currencies. You do have some of the Dutch islands that use the US dollar as their currency. You have Bonaire, Saba, St. Eustatius. When Curacao and St. Martin decided that they were going to ask the Kingdom of the Netherlands for status aparte, those three islands decided they did not want status aparte, and so they adopted the US dollar as their own currency. Other than those three little islands in the Caribbean, all of us have our own currency. However, the US dollar is widely accepted in the Caribbean. There's hardly a country in the Caribbean, or hardly a merchant or private individual, that will refuse US dollars if you try to pay for something in US dollars. In Cuba, you might have that challenge because it's illegal, and really the authorities, you're supposed to hand over US dollars to the authorities, but Cuba is a very highly nuanced case, right? So you have two currency unions in this region: the currency union of St. Martin and Curacao. And then you have the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, which makes, I think it's 8 jurisdictions that use the EC dollar, the Eastern Caribbean dollar, which is one of the oldest and most stable and strongest monetary unions on earth. As a matter of fact, the European Union came here to the Caribbean to study the EC dollar when they were constructing the EU, the Euro Currency Union. That currency is almost 100% backed by US dollars, which means it's a currency board arrangement. In the Cayman Islands, they also have a currency board arrangement, which means the Cayman Islands dollar is fully backed by the US dollar, although the Cayman Islands dollar is stronger than the US dollar and very stable. As far as I'm aware, those are the only two currency boards. A currency board is basically, I mean, it's a complex thing that if you really want to get into the technicality of it, but what's really important is that you don't print any amount of your own currency. You must have a backing of whatever you decide you want to back it with. You could back it with gold if you want, and that was how the old currency boards used to work. Modern day currency boards generally are backed by US dollars. And so the central bank will only print EC dollars or Cayman dollars insofar as they have US dollars in their reserve to back 100% how much they're printing. So in other words, unless you're earning this currency, these US dollars via your exports, your financial services, your tourism, then you cannot just print currency, your own currency, and inflate your economy when you have a currency board arrangement. The rest of us moved away from currency board arrangements. Most of us started out as currency boards, right? And we might have been backed by sterling. But all of us moved away from currency boards, and we now have currencies that are pegged to the US dollar. What does that mean? We decide what's the exchange rate between our currency and the US dollar. In the case of Barbados, it's 2 Barbados dollars to 1 US dollar. In the case of Bahamas, it's 1 to 1. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, it's 6.8 to 1. And then you have a few currencies. So the EC dollar is 2.7 to 1, right? Then you have a few currencies like Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname, where their currencies move over time against the US dollar. In the case of Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, we've been depreciating in the last, you could say, maybe 15 years, 10 years, there's been, and certainly 20 years, more of a depreciation against the US dollar. Jamaica as well, although Jamaica's currency sometimes fluctuates in both directions. But most of the countries in the Caribbean have a hard peg, meaning that the exchange rate doesn't change. They've kept it there for, 50 years, roughly. So, but those few that I just highlighted, we do see some movement in the exchange rate against the benchmark, which is the US dollar. If you wanted to have your own currency, you could very much have it. Cayman Islands has 60,000 people, half of them are expatriates, and they have their own currency. And it's the strongest currency in the region and stronger than the US dollar, very stable. You have the whole Eastern Caribbean. I just ran through that, their reality, their currency situation. So no, absolutely not. You can very much have your own currency. The question is, would you come up with your own currency, or would you adopt, like you have some countries that adopt the US dollar as their own country, their own currency, and they're called dollarized, like Panama, for example, is dollarized. And you have to pay to the Fed a certain amount every year for the use of their dollar. The question is whether you would want to have your own currency, or you would adopt a currency that somebody else has already issued. I think that having your own currency, like everything else on earth, in this life, everything is a trade-off, right? Um, there will be advantages and disadvantages to having your own currency. I think that the main advantage to having your own currency is that it gives you a policy tool that you can use to manage your economy. Okay. And it's a very important policy tool if you are a country that is quite open. When I say open, I mean you have to add total exports to total imports as a percentage of your GDP. For us in the Caribbean, most of us, total exports plus imports over GDP is over 100%, right? The amount of trade that we engage in to survive explains most of our economy, right? We sell tourism, we sell oil and gas, we still sell sugar and rum in order to import the food and fuel that we need to survive. So if you're a highly open economy, and I know that Scotland does have oil and gas as well, if you're a highly open economy, you export a lot and you import a lot, then your currency becomes that much more powerful a tool to manage your economy than if you were not an open economy. The other consideration is when you use somebody else's currency, you almost import their inflation and their interest rate policy. So, for example, you have the US. They during the pandemic, they engaged in unprecedented monetary easing and fiscal easing and stimulus. And then post pandemic, so in 2021 into 2022, early, they tightened monetary policy. Now, if my country was using the US dollar, that means interest rates on my currency would go up. And if I had to borrow, it would be that much more expensive. But my country is in a recession. Why would I want higher interest rates? I wouldn't. But the US was not in a recession when they started hiking interest rates. So you import their policy when it may not be relevant to your own economic scenario at that point in time. So there's a real danger with using somebody else's currency for that reason as well. There can be benefits to being in a monetary union. Stability is one of them. Certainly in the Eastern Caribbean, the the currency union is credited as being responsible for a lot of their financial and monetary stability, and price movements as well in terms of their inflation. Um, but that's because these countries are very similar in nature, right? And so it makes sense for them to have a monetary union. But when you have a monetary union like the EU, where you have a country like Germany that has the same currency, same interest rate policy at the same time as a country like Greece or now Latvia, I mean, when I look at that, for a small country, I just think that's just so wrong. It just makes no sense. So unless you are very, very similar and your trade is so integrated and other things are so integrated that it makes sense to have a monetary union, perhaps it's best to have your own.
That's a really interesting
That's
point.
fascinating.
Yeah.
I would say at the moment in Scotland, there's a history here of interest rates being increased to reduce the property bubble in London, which
Right.
has
Has
no
nothing to do with you.
impact. So we're already feeling that. And if Scotland was to become independent and keep sterling, the UK currency, then these problems would just be exaggerated, especially as Scotland
Yeah.
tried to become a very different economy than it is at the moment. So it's been fascinating getting your views there.